The African Child, Chapter 7. I was growing up. The time had come for me to join the Society of the Uninitiated, this rather mysterious society. And at that age, it was very mysterious to me, though not very secret, contained all the young boys, all the uncircumcised of 12, 13, or 14 years of age, and it was run by our elders, whom we called the Big Condés. I joined it one evening before the feast of Ramadan. As soon as the sun had gone down, the tom-tom had begun to beat. Even though it was being played in a remote part of the compounds, the notes had roused me at once, had struck my breast, had struck right at my heart, just as if Kodoke, our best player, had been playing for me alone. A little later, I had heard faintly the shrill voices of boys accompanying the tom-tom with their cries and singing. Yes, the time had come for me. It was the first time I had spent the feast of Ramadan at Kurosa. Until this year, my grandmother had always insisted on my spending it with her at Tindikan. All that morning, and even more so in the afternoon, I had been in a state of great agitation, with everyone busy preparing for the festival, bumping into and pushing each other and asking me to help. Outside, the uproar was just as bad. Kurosa is the chief town of our region, and all the canton chiefs, attended by their musicians, make it a custom to gather here for the festival. From the gateway to the compound, I had watched them pass by, with their companies of praise singers, balaphonists, and guitarists, drum and tom-tom players. Until now, I had only been thinking of the festival and of the sumptuous feast that awaited me. But now, there was something quite different in the wind. The screaming crowd that surrounded Kodoke and his tom-tom was getting nearer. It was going from one compound to another. It would stop for a moment in each compound where there was a boy of an age, as I was, to join the society, and it would take the boy away. That is why it was so slow in coming, yet so sure, so ineluctable, as ineluctable as the fate that awaited me. What fate? My meeting with Condé Diera. Now I was not unaware who Condé Diera was. Often my mother, and at times my uncles, had talked of him only too much, had threatened me only too often with Condé Diera, that terrible boogeyman, that lion that eats up little boys. And here was Condé Diera. But was he a man? Was he an animal? Was he not rather half man, half animal? My friend Kuyate believed he was more man than beast. Here was Condé Diera, living the dim world of hearsay. Here he was, taking on flesh and blood, yes, and was prowling, roused by Kodoke's tom-tom, around the dark town. This night was to be the night of Condé Diera. I could hear now, very plainly, the beating of the tom-tom, Kodoke was much nearer. I could hear perfectly the chanting and the shouts that rose into the dark. I could make out distinctly the rather hollow, crisp, well-marked beats of the chorus that are a kind of miniature canoe and are beaten with a bit of wood. I was standing at the entrance to the compound, waiting. I, too, was holding, ready to play it, my koro, with a stick clutched nervously in my hand. I was waiting, hidden by the shadow of the hut. I was waiting, filled with a dreadful anxiety, my eyes searching the blackness. "Well?" asked my father. He had crossed the workshop without my hearing him. "Are you afraid?" "A little," I replied. He laid his hand on my shoulder. "It's all right. Don't worry." He drew me to him, and I could feel his warmth. It warmed me too, and I began to feel less frightened. My heart did not beat so fast. "I too went through this test," said my father. "What happens to you?" I asked. "Nothing you need really be afraid of. Nothing you cannot overcome by your own willpower. Remember, you have to control your fear. You have to control yourself. Condé Diera will not take you away. He will roar, but he won't do more than roar. You won't be frightened now, will you?" "I'll try not to be." "Even if you are frightened, do not show it." He went away, and I began waiting again. And the disturbing uproar came nearer and nearer. Suddenly, I saw the crowd emerging from the dark and rushing towards me. Kodoke, his tom-tom slung over one shoulder, was marching at their head, followed by the drummers. I ran back quickly into the yard, and standing in the middle of it, I awaited, with as much pluck as I could muster, the awful invasion. I did not have long to wait. The crowd was upon me. It was spreading tumultuously all round me, overwhelming me with shouts and cries and beating tom-toms, beating drums. It formed a circle, and I found myself in the center, alone, curiously isolated, still free and yet already captive. Inside the circle, I recognized Kuyate and others, many of them friends of mine who had been collected as the crowd moved on, collected as I was to be, as I already was. And it seemed to me there were none of them looking very happy. But was I any more than they were? I began to beat my koro as they were doing. Perhaps I was beating it with less confidence than they. At this point, young girls and women joined the circle and began to dance. Young men and adolescents, stepping out of the crowd, moved into the circle too and began to dance facing the women. The men sang. The women clapped their hands. Soon, the only ones left to form the circle were the uncircumcised boys. They too began to sing. They were not allowed to dance, and as they sang in unison, they forgot their anxiety. I too mingled my voice with theirs. When Having formed a circle again, the crowd left our compound. I went with it, almost willingly, beating my choro with great enthusiasm. Kuyate was on my right. Towards the middle of the night, our tour of the town and the collection of uncircumcised boys was finished. We had arrived at the farthest outskirts of the compounds, and in front of us lay only the dark scrubland. Here the women and young girls left us. Then the grown men left us. We were alone with the older boys, or should I say, delivered over to the older boys, for I remember the often rather disagreeable natures and rarely pleasant manners of these older ones. The women and young girls now hurried back to their dwellings. Actually, they cannot have been any more at ease than we were. I know for a fact that not one of them would have ventured to leave town on this night. In a short while, when Condé Diera would begin to roar, they would not be able to stop shaking with fright. They would all be shaking in their shoes and making sure the doors were all properly barred. For them, as for us, though in a much less significant way, this night would be the night of Condé Diera. As soon as our elders had made sure that no intruder was present to disturb the mysteriousness of the ceremony, we left the town behind and entered the bush by a path which leads to a sacred place where each year the initiation takes place. The place is well known. It is situated under an enormous bombax tree, a hollow at the junction of the river Komoni and the river Niger. At normal times, it is not forbidden to go there, but certainly it has not always been so. And some emanation from the past I never knew seems to hover around the huge trunk of the bombax tree. I think that a night such as the one we were going through must certainly have resurrected a part of that past. We were walking in silence, closely hemmed in by our elders. Perhaps they were afraid we might escape. It looked like it. I do not think, however, that the idea of escape had occurred to any of us. The night, and that particular night, seemed impenetrable. Who knew where Condé Diera had his lair? Who knew where he was prowling? But was it not right here, near the hollow? Yes, it must be here. And if we had to face him, and certainly we had to face him, it would surely be better to do so in a crowd, in this jostling group that seemed to make us all one, and seemed like a last refuge from the peril that was approaching. Nonetheless, however intimate our jostling proximity to one another, and however careful the vigilance of our elders, it could not be denied that the silence of our progress, after the recent uproar, as we marched far from the huts, through the wan moonlight, and even more, the thought of the sacred place towards which we were going, and finally, and above all, the concealed presence of Condé Diera. All these things filled us with terror. Just before we reached the hollow, we saw flames leap up from a huge wood fire that the bushes had hidden from us until then. Kuyate squeezed my arm. and I knew he was referring to the fire. I quickened my steps. We all quickened our steps, and the crimson radiance of the fire enveloped us. We had a harbor now, a kind of haven from the night, a huge blaze, and at our backs, the bombax tree's enormous trunk. Oh, it was a precarious haven. But however poor, it was infinitely better than the silence and the dark, the sullen silence of the dark. We assembled beneath the bombax tree. The ground beneath had been cleared of reeds and tall grasses. Our elders suddenly shouted, "Kneel!" We at once fell to our knees. Heads down! We lowered our heads. Lower than that! We bent our heads right to the ground, as if in prayer. Now hide your eyes. We don't have to be told twice. We shut our eyes tight and pressed our hands over them. For would we not die of fright and horror if we should see, or so much as catch a glimpse of Condé Diera? Our elders walked up and down behind us and in front of us to make sure that we had all obeyed their orders to the letter. Woe to him who would have the audacity to disobey. We would be cruelly whipped. Now that we are on our knees with our foreheads to the ground and our hands pressed over our eyes, Condé Diera's roaring suddenly bursts out. We were expecting to hear this hoarse roar. We were not expecting any other sound, but it takes us by surprise and shatters us, freezes our hearts with its unexpectedness. And it is not only a lion. It is not only Condé Diera roaring. There are 10, 20, perhaps 30 lions that take their lead from him, uttering their terrible roars and surrounding the hollow. 10 or 30 lions separated from us by a few yards only, and that the great wood's fire will perhaps not always keep at bay. Lions of every size and every age. We can tell that by the way they roar. From the very oldest lion to the very youngest cubs. No, not one of us would dream of venturing to open an eye. Not one. Not one of us would dare to lift his head from the ground. He would rather bury it in the earth. And I bend down as far as I can. We all bend down further. We bend our knees as much as we can. We keep our backs as low as possible. I make myself. We all make ourselves as small as we can. You must not be afraid, I told myself. You must conquer your fear. Your father told you to overcome your fear. But how could I not be afraid? Even inside the town, far from this clearing, women and children were trembling and crouching in their huts. They were listening to Condé Diera roaring. Many of them were stopping their ears so as not to hear him roaring. A few bolder spirits might be getting up. It needs some courage to leave one's bed just now, to make quite sure once more that their hut door is closed, to make quite sure that it is securely bolted and barred. Nevertheless, they are still as frightened as anyone else. How can I possibly not give way to my terror. I who am within reach of the monster. If it so pleased him, he could leap right through the fire and plunge his terrible claws into my flesh. Not for a single instant do I doubt the presence of the monster. Who could assemble such a numerous herd, hold such a nocturnal revel, if not Condé Diera? He alone, I told myself, he alone has such power over lions. Keep away, Condé Diera. Keep away. Go back into the bush. But Condé Diera went on with his revels, and sometimes it seemed to me that he roared right over my own head, right in my own ears even. Keep away, I implore thee, Condé Diera. What was it my father had said? Condé Diera roars, but he won't do more than roar. He will not take you away. Yes, something like that. But is it true? Really true? There is also a rumor that Condé Diera sometimes pounces with fearsome claws on someone or other and carries him far away, far, far away into the depths of the bush. And then, days and days afterwards, months or even years later, quite by chance, a huntsman may discover some whitened bones. And do not people also die of fright? How I wish this roaring would stop. How I wish. How I wish I was far away from this clearing, back in the compound, in the warm security of the hut. Will this roar never end? Go away, Condé Diera. Go away. Stop roaring. Oh, those roars. I feel as if I can bear them no longer. Whereupon, suddenly, they stop. They stop just as they had begun. So suddenly, in fact, that I feel only reluctant relief. Is it over? Really over? Is it not just a temporary interruption? No, I dare not feel relieved just yet. And then suddenly, the voice of one of the older boys rings out. Get up. I heave a sigh of relief. This time, it's really over. We look at one another. I look at Kuyati and the others. If there were only a little more light, but the light from the fire is sufficient. Great drops of sweat are still beading our foreheads, yet the night is chill. Yes, we were afraid. We were not able to control our fear. A new command rang out, and we sat down in front of the fire. Now our elders begin our initiation. All night long, they will teach us the songs of the uncircumcised, and we must remain quite still, repeating the words after them, singing the melody after them. There we sit, as if we were in school again, attentive, very attentive, and very obedient. Our lessons ended with the dawn. My legs and arms were numb. I worked my joints and rubbed my legs for a while, but my blood still flowed slowly. I was really worn out, and I was cold. Looking round me, I could not understand why I shook with fear during the night. The first rays of dawn were falling so gently, so reassuringly on the bombax tree, on the clearing. The sky looked so pure. Who could believe that only a few hours ago, a whole herd of lions, led by Condé Diera himself, had been angrily roaring among these tall reeds and grasses, separated from us only by a wood fire, which now was almost dead? No one would have believed it, and I should have doubted the evidence of my own ears and thought I was waking up from a bad dream, if one or the other of my companions had not now and then cast a suspicious glance at the tallest grasses. For what were those long white threads which hung from, or rather waved from the top of the bombax tree, and which appeared to write on the sky the direction in which the town lay? I had not time to wonder very long at this. Our elders were regrouping us, and because the majority were almost walking in their sleep, the operation was carried out not without difficulty, not without shouts and some rough treatment. Finally, we started off back to the town, singing our new songs, and we sang them with unbelievably carefree abandon. Even so, the steed that scents the approaching stable suddenly quickens his pace, however weary he may be. When we reached the first compound, the presence of the long white threads struck me once more. All the principal huts bore these threads on the summit of the roof. "Do you see those white threads?" I said to Kuyati. "I can see them. They are always there after the ceremony in the clearing." "Who puts them there?" Kuyati shrugged his shoulders. "That's where they come from," I said, pointing to the distant bombax tree. "Someone must have climbed up." "Who could possibly climb up a bombax tree?" "I don't know." "Could anyone possibly get his arms round such a huge trunk?" I said. "And even if he could, how could he hoist himself up on a back covered with all these thorns?" "You're talking nonsense. Can't you imagine what a job it would be just to reach the first branches?" "How should I know any more than you?" said Kuyati. "But this is the first time I've attended this sort of ceremony, whereas you—" I did not finish the sentence. We had reached the main square of the town. I stared in amazement at the bombax trees of the marketplace. They, too, were ornamented with the same white threads, all but the humblest huts. Indeed, and all the big trees were tied to one another by these white threads, whose focal point was the enormous bombax tree in the clearing, the sacred place marked by the bombax tree. "The swallows, tie them on," said Kuyati suddenly. "Swallows? Are you crazy?" I said. "Swallows do not fly by night." I questioned one of the older boys who was walking beside us. "It is our great chief who does it," he said. Our chief turns himself into a swallow during the night. He flies from tree to tree and from hut to hut, and all these threads are tied on in less time than it takes to tell. Does he fly from tree to tree? I asked. Can he fly like a swallow? Why, yes, of course. He is a real swallow. He can fly as swiftly as any swallow. Everybody knows that. There. What did I tell you? Said Kuyati. I did not say another word. The night of Condé Diera was a strange night, a terrible and miraculous night, a night that passed all understanding. As on the previous evening, we went from one compound to another, preceded by tom-toms and drums, and our companions left one after another as they reached their homes. Whenever we passed a compound where someone whose courage had failed him had refused to join us, a mocking chant rose from our ranks. I got back to our compound, completely exhausted, but very satisfied with myself. I had taken part in the ceremony of the lions. Even if I had not put up much of a show when Condé Diera was roaring, that was my own affair. I could keep that to myself. I passed triumphantly over the threshold of our dwelling place. The feast of Ramadan was beginning. In the yard, I saw my parents, who were dressed ready to go to the mosque. Here you are at last, said my mother. Here I am, said I proudly. What kind of a time is this to come home? She said, pressing me to her bosom. The night is over, and you haven't had a wink of sleep. The ceremony did not finish until break of day, I said. I know, she said. All you men are crazy. What about the lions? Asked my father. What about Condé Diera? I heard them, I replied. They were very close. They were as near to me as I am to you now. There was only the fire between us. It's crazy, said my mother. Go to bed. You are dropping with sleep. She turned towards my father. I ask you, where's the sense in all that? Well, it's the custom, said my father. I don't like such customs, she said. Young boys should not have to stay awake all night. Were you afraid? Asked my father. Should I admit that I was very frightened? Of course he was afraid, said my mother. Only a little, said my father. Go to bed, said my mother. If you don't get some sleep now, you'll fall asleep during the feast. It is only after having taken part several times in the lion ceremony that we begin vaguely to understand what goes on. But we still keep it a secret. We only talk about what we have guessed to those of our companions who have shared the same experience. And even so, the real secret is not revealed to us until the day of our final initiation into manhood. Later, I got to know who Condé was, and I learned also that the dangers were non-existent. But I only learned these things when the time had come for me to learn them. As long as we are not circumcised, as long as we have not attained that second life that is our true existence, we are told nothing, and we can find out nothing. No, they were not real lions that were roaring in the clearing, for it was the older boys, plainly and simply the older boys. They create the roaring sounds with small buds, thick at the center, sharp at the edges. The bud is ellipsoidal in shape and very small. There is a hole on one side that permits it to be tied to a string. The older boys swing it round like a sling, and to increase the speed of the gyrations, they too turn with it. The bud cuts through the air and produces roaring sounds similar to a lion's roar. The smallest buds imitate the roaring of lion cubs, the biggest ones the roaring of full-grown lions. It's childishly simple. What is not so childish is the effect produced at night on someone who does not expect it. Their heart freezes. If it was not for the far greater fear of finding themselves lost in the bush, the terror it creates would make the boys run away. But if Condé Diera's roaring is easily explained, the presence of the long white threads binding the great bombax tree in the sacred clearing to the tallest trees and the principal houses of the town is less easily explained. For my own part, I never succeeded in obtaining an explanation. At the time when I might have obtained it, that is, when I should have taken my place among the older boys who conducted the ceremony, I was no longer living in Korosa. All I know is that these threads are spun from cotton, and that bamboo rods are used to tie them to the summits of the bombax tree. Our bombax trees are very big, and it is difficult to imagine perches 60 feet high. Such structures would certainly collapse, no matter how carefully they had been put together. Moreover, I do not see how the summit of these thorny trees could be reached by climbing. There is, of course, a kind of belt which tree climbers use. The belt is tied round the tree, and the climber gets inside it, placing the belt against the small of his back, then climbs by a series of jerks, pressing against the trunk with his feet. But such a proceeding is quite unthinkable, given the dimensions of the trunk of our enormous bombax trees. Or, why not plainly and simply use a sling? I do not know. A good slinger can work miracles. Perhaps it is this sort of miracle which would account for the inexplicable presence of white threads at the summit of the bombax trees, but I can come to no final decision about it. All I know is that the older ones who tie these threads to the tops of trees must be extraordinarily careful not to leave their bamboo rods lying about. They must not give themselves away. Now, all it would need would be a bamboo rod left carelessly at the foot of one of the trees to give the show away to the women and children. That is why, as soon as the threads have been tied, the first thing they do is to hide away their rods and poles. The usual hiding places are in the thatch of a roof or in remote parts of the bush. And in this way, no material evidence remains of these manifestations of the power of Condé Diera. But what about the men? What about those who do know? They just won't breathe a single word about it. They keep their knowledge a close secret. Not only do they keep women and children in a state of uncertainty and terror, they also warn them to keep the doors of their hearts firmly barred. I am not unaware that such conduct might appear strange, but it is absolutely true. If the ceremony of the lions has the character of a game, if it is for the most part pure mystification, yet it has one important feature. It is a test, a training in hardship, a rite, the prelude to a tribal rite. And for the present, that is all one can say. It is obvious that if the secret was given away, the ceremony will lose much of its power. Certainly, the teaching which follows the roaring of Condé Diera would remain the same, but nothing will remain of the trial by fear. That occasion when there is given to every boy the opportunity to overcome his own baser nature. Nothing would remain of the necessary preparation for the painful tribal rite of circumcision. But at the moment of writing, is there any part of the rite that still remains? The secret. Do we still have secrets? Secrets.